Welcome to the Ethical Culture Society of Westchester Sunday meeting. Our address today has been provided by Dr. Robert Berson, leader for the Ethical Society of Northern Westchester in Ossining, New York. The title of Bob's address is, What Might We Mean by Spirituality?
Good morning, everybody. And since you have all defined spirituality already, I could leave now if you'd like. But I won't. Although it is a nice day to have class outside, as the kids at Fieldston would often ask me to do. Let me begin with the tradition at Northern Westchester. The opening Sunday of the year, I always read the same passage of Felix Adler's. And even though it's not the first Sunday of the fall, I will read it to you folks, because I think it's a good one. Identify yourself with mankind. Think of yourself as a disciple of Prometheus and as a part of man's life through the ages. Now, I should excuse Felix Adler, a Victorian gentleman, for only using the words man and stuff like that, mankind. So read humanity when we use words like that in your own mind. Carry the past into your present. Study history, not with a view of knowing all the facts, for that is impossible, but so as to come into contact with those great moments in which humanity put forward a living effort, and so that you too may receive the contagion of that effort. Consider what the need of mankind is at the present day, and in choosing a vocation, consider what your own strengths are and where you can best make them count. But taking material wealth and reputation as secondary, pursue a vocation for the main purpose of promoting the progress of your species. Consider mankind and not primarily your individual self. Finally, in all things, look to the end. Conceive of the various lines of progress in science and art, in technology and the like. Conceive of these lines, seemingly parallel, as converging toward a final end. In other words, conceive of progress spiritually. And of that end, the simplest expression is that a state of things shall exist among men in which the law of the jungle, of life subsisting on life, shall be replaced by life enhancing other life. Those words of Adler's say we should conceive of progress spiritually. What might he have meant by spiritually? What might we infer from his use of the word? What might we mean? In that passage, Adler suggests something about a final end, an ultimate goal. As he says, a state of things where life enhances other life. Is that a lovely vision? I would think so. Is it an ideal to work forward? I think so. But note, it has a kind of naturalistic, not supernatural tone to it. Life enhancing other life. Life, down here, what we are all experiencing right now. Do we want more from Adler in terms of that word, spiritual? Do we want a thicker definition, a tighter definition, a richer description of what he means by spiritual? Or might some of us want less? Some of my colleagues in ethical cultural leadership think we should avoid the word spiritual completely. And even Felix Adler urges some caution. He says, quote, the word spiritual becomes a synonym of muddy thought and misty emotionalism. Did I hear any misty emotionalism in that discussion time? But the word does come up often. There was a recent article in the New Yorker, for example, about Charles de Gaulle, and it spoke about the student uprisings in France in 1968. And the author writes, quote, the events of May seemed to exhaust him spiritually, close quote. There's no explanation of that by the author, but he continues that de Gaulle resigned a year later. There's an awful lot there that could be enriched. The word came up for me fairly recently this fall, as it often does when I was speaking to a couple about their wedding. We're not religious, one of them said, but we are spiritual. And I thought, quietly, not critically, but with real interest, whatever do they mean? Now that reminds me of an ethical culture colleague of mine, a leader colleague, who once said in response to that statement, I am not spiritual, but I am religious. And it's worth remembering that ethical culture is recognized in the law as a religion. Interesting. Although I must say, Felix Adler said ethical culture is religious for those who are religiously minded, and philosophical and ethical for those who are philosophically and ethical minded. It's wonderful to have a founder, which humanists can do, whom we can respect, but do not have to revere. Coming back to spirituality. Adler used the word in titles of two of his books. In 1905, The Essentials of Spirituality, and in 1924, The Reconstruction of the Spiritual Ideal. Those were lectures that he gave at Oxford University, invited lectures. Felix Adler was invited to Oxford to give lectures in the same decade that Rabindranath Tagore was invited to Oxford to give lectures in the same series. And Adler also uses the word spiritual and spirituality often in his book, An Ethical Philosophy of Life. Later, if you like, I can give you a good definition of religion, but I'll hold that as a temptation. The word spiritually comes up, and so I decided to think about it and try to say some things about it, which may be a bit impressionistically, it may be a bit like Jackson Pollock, or like your children or grandchildren throwing food on the floor from the high chair. Let me begin, though, by saying that I am asked occasionally, less than frequently, but more than rarely, is ethical culture spiritual? Interesting. What would you say to someone you met at a cocktail party or a football game who turned to you out of the blue and said, Alex, is ethical culture spiritual? Also, several times in my life, I've been accused of being a spiritual person. Now, the accuser is always someone with whom I have a fond relationship. Now, I've been accused of many other things, especially being a perpetrator, a purveyor of bad puns and unscrupulous wordplay. I would like to point out, however, that Felix Adler, in his private life, was known to be a devotee of puns and even off-color humor, but only in privacy. I have that on good authority from his daughter, Ruth Adler Fries. Anyway, being accused of being a spiritual person is probably one of the nicer accusations I've ever had. But I say probably because it's rarely clear what the accuser might mean, and I'm almost never quite sure what I should infer. But the good thing about the question, is ethical culture spiritual, and the accusation, you're a spiritual person, the good thing is that I really can't give a quick, ready answer. I have to pause and start a conversation. And that's kind of what I'd like to do today. To start a conversation about some of the words we use and their meanings for us. Do those words have relevance to ethical culture, to humanism in general? Do those words relate to our experiences? Do they generate ideals, inspirations that we might want to live with? So I'll begin by some of the conversations that I've had and thoughts that came up in them, which I'm sure will echo some of the conversations you had this morning. I'll touch very briefly on some of Felix Adler's thoughts, and then I'll try to wrap up with some of my own muddling. In conversations, when the words spiritual or spirituality come up, or people speak of a spiritual experience or a spiritual feeling, I think what the best we can do is to say, tell me more about that. Or ask, what were those experiences? What were they like? What were the feelings that were generated? Make it a conversation. And think for a moment, as you did before, what experiences have you had that you would call spiritual? You talked about that with each other. What were they? What experiences? How did you feel? What did those experiences or feelings do to you or for you? Now, in speaking with people in traditional religions, which I do frequently, I can probably bet on the fact that I am the only man in the room who kisses 4 Roman Catholics a month. Women, sisters, nuns. What's even more amazing is they kiss me back in our local interfaith clergy group. When they talk about spiritual experience, they often talk about participation in their religious services. A ritual that symbolizes or expresses or creates a relationship with what they see to be holy or sacred or divine. They talk about in those services feeling part of a community, part of a history that extends way back into the past and will continue into the future. When they pray or chant or sing together, they feel part of a community of faith. Sometimes when they talk about spirituality, they speak about being in a holy place. It might be a building. It might be a holy spot in nature. I'm thinking about an interfaith youth group we used to have in Ossining, where at one point we had a gathering which included a Roman Catholic nun, an Episcopal priest from Africa, a Buddhist monk, a rabbi, an evangelical Protestant minister. I'm leaving somebody out, but I'm thinking of the last, who was a Lakota medicine chief. And in talking to the kids in our youth group, he said, "You people think that the Great Plains where I come from are vast empty spaces. You just don't know. It's really crowded out there. There's a spirit with everything, every rock, every tree, every flower, every natural phenomenon. There is a spirit there. You just don't see them." How interesting. Well, that's a natural sense of holiness that that man had. Others talk about being in the presence of a sacred image as a spiritual experience, an icon, some depiction of a significant or holy personage, or miraculous moment or miraculous event. People talk also about spirituality in solitary prayer or meditation, feeling the presence of and a relationship with their deity. Sometimes they talk about feeling at one with the creation, with the cosmos. And in many of those experiences, people talk about feelings of awe, gratitude, a sense of meaning and purpose in their existence. They may feel restored or strengthened or hopeful, more able to get on with their lives. Those are the experiences they talk about when they take the word spiritual, push it aside, and talk about the experience itself. Well, people who are not traditionally religious also use the word spiritual. Often, many of them talk also about an experience in nature, being on the top of a hill or a mountain, seeing afar, seeing the beauty and grandeur of the natural world, of which they feel a part. And they call that a spiritual experience. People talk about being outside on a clear night, looking up at the stars. Again, the magnificence of the universe, feeling part of the cosmos. People say they felt awe, even some kind of reverence. But that's clearly a naturalistic sense of reverence, not a reference to some supernatural phenomenon. Some people talk about spirituality in aesthetic experiences, being moved by music or art, the wonder of human creativity. They feel a connection with the composer or the artist of long ago or far away, a human connection with someone whose work touches them. Sometimes they feel connected with others who also are moved by the experience, the audience in the concert hall, the people at the museum looking at the same work of art. People also talk about a spiritual experience when they talk about being part of a community of endeavor, participating with others in a cause. Might be a protest, a demonstration, a march for social justice, people standing together in a silent vigil. Many people talk about personal moments, doing or receiving an act of kindness, experiencing generosity of spirit, feeling the potential for compassion, feeling gratitude. Sometimes people say they feel spiritual when they empathize in sorrow or joy with others, feeling the common humanity of the human family. People talk about being understood, accepted, truly witnessed by another human being. People talk about observing the love of a mother and a father and an infant, seeing that human experience as a spiritual experience. They use the word. Right, Dale? I was part of that conversation too, Alex. I heard some comments. Some people talk about having a spiritual practice. It's interesting to hear humanists talk about their spiritual practice. And I wonder, why are they using, I'm talking about ethical culture folks, why do they use the word spiritual when they talk about meditating or yoga or running? Those are profound experiences for many people. What puts the stamp spiritual on those experiences for them? People talk about observing or even reading about reconciliations as a spiritual experience. Read Robert Sapolsky's book, Behave, but go to the gym first because it's about 700 pages. It's good for progressive exercise work. A brilliant book about human behavior. Toward the end of the book, he talks about a Japanese pilot who bombed Pearl Harbor, going to a ceremony at Pearl Harbor, a memorial for the dead Americans, apologizing, and becoming a friend of a man whose boat was bombed, perhaps by him. The American soldier played taps at those ceremonies. He was a bugler. He began to play the Japanese version of taps as well as the American version after meeting the Japanese airmen who had bombed him. In all of those comments, both from the traditionally religious and the not traditionally religious, forgive me, I've summarized them rather prosaically. People often speak poetry without knowing it when they talk about such experiences. What they say to me is so much richer in detail than simply saying, I had a spiritual experience. So I urge all of us to ask ourselves, what was going on? Tell the story. Most of those people in some way are also expressing a sense of connection to all of humanity. That to me is very interesting, especially the humanists. Well, I've been sharing comments about spirituality that people have shared with me. What did Felix Adler say? What are some of the things that Adler said? Adler said spirituality begins with a felt need to give our lives a new and higher quality. Some kind of yearning that we might all be feeling. He said the highest end is moral completeness, and adds, spirituality consists in always keeping in view this supreme end. Or, quote, spirituality is nothing but morality raised to its highest power. Interesting. But again, I ask, Felix, why did you need the word spiritual then? Why not talk about morality as the highest end and leave it at that? Adler says we move towards that spiritual attitude through self-reflection, through acknowledging our mortality, through recognizing that the sufferings of others are very similar to our own, or in Adler's words again, to desire that others may manifest the excellence that is latent in them, be it like to or different from our own, to desire that they shall have credit for every excellence they possess, and to sedulously aid them in developing such excellences as they can attain to. That is the spiritual attitude, to bring out the best in others and ourselves. Now, Adler concludes his book, The Essentials of Spirituality, repeating, spirituality is morality carried to a finish, to seek the worth in every person and do what we can to bring that worth out. So even for Adler, who uses the word a lot, spirituality seems to be about human relationships, not relationships with supernaturals or abstractions. And again, I think it's fair to ask, do we need the word? To what extent do we need the word? How do we want to use the word? But Adler continues to use that word with some amplification. In an ethical philosophy of life, a couple of quotations, he urges us to encourage an ideal of, quote, universal interdependence, or consciousness of universal connectedness, the consciousness of the interrelatedness of life with life, the reciprocal, universal, infinite interrelatedness. Over and over, phrases like that come up in his work. He's asking us to conceive of an ideal of unique individuals related in a way in which each enables others to flourish in the interrelationship of all. In his book, An Ethical Philosophy of Life, he says spiritual ideals, continuing to use his use of the term, come up out of spiritual pain throughout history. He talks about the ancient Hebrews who experienced the pain of oppression and developed a sense of something sacred in each person which should never be violated. For the early Christians, he says, the pain was the awareness of the evil within us, the possibility that we can do evil as well as good. And that's the source of our spiritual pain. And then he asks, what for us are the spiritual pains we experience? This is 1923. And he talks about three things: the sense of insignificance when we look at the enormity of space and the infinite length of time and our descent from slimy lower creatures in evolution. We no longer feel that we are special creations of a deity, the center of the universe, the purpose of it all. Second, he says we see the sufferings of others. Remember, we just lived through the World War in 1923. We see poverty as well. We see exploitation. And the third is our divided conscience. He says no matter how good we may be in our private lives, in our ethical societies, in our homes, we have to go out into a world which is often rough, the world of business, the world of politics. So we can ask ourselves, about 100 years later, what might be the spiritual pains, in Adler's terms, the causes of suffering that we experience now today? Adler says that the ideal he has is one of organic relationships. An organic relationship is a relationship in which each element of an organism is distinct, yet each is integrated into and necessary for the functioning of the whole. My stomach is different from my heart, but they're integrated. Each is distinct, yet each is necessary for the functioning of me, the whole. So he asks us to envision a web of relationships, of distinct but interdependent individuals, each necessary to the whole community, creating what he calls an infinite spiritual commonwealth. Those of you who've studied Hinduism know about the web of Indra, the king of the gods. I'll come back to that metaphor later if you like. Each of us is to recognize that we are all small but indispensable parts of a whole, at least in an ideal sense. We're all connected. We're both influenced and influential. Our lives touch and are touched by other lives. It's a view remarkably like the Swahili concept of Ubuntu. There's a phrase that I can't possibly pronounce, but you can get online if you look for it, which says in Swahili, a person is a person through other people. Only in relationship do we become real, unique, significant individuals. The way to implement that idea, that spiritual practice might say, is to act in Adler's maxim, to elicit the best in others, and in so doing, elicit the best in yourself. Well, I'm going to conclude, as I've been meandering rather impressionistically. I will say that I will probably avoid using the word spiritual as much as possible, because if I use it, people may draw unwarranted inferences. They may think I'm saying something that reflects their upbringing and not what I mean. So I'm going to try to be more descriptive and less labely. I'm not sure humanistically oriented people even need to use the word. And when I hear it, I'm always going to say, tell me what you mean. What was that experience? But we can use the word if we wish. So I'm not saying eliminate it. I don't believe in censorship. But articulate what we mean when we use that word. And so now I'm going to do something some of you may have been itching for if you've been listening. What does the dictionary say about the word, right? Don't we always start with the dictionary definition? Right, but I've deliberately avoided that until now. I'm going to offer some dictionary definitions. I looked at 3 or 4 dictionaries, and I was surprised by what I read. Let me read some definitions of spirit, spiritual, and spirituality. Spirit. This is very small, forgive me. The life principle, especially in man. The thinking, motivating, feeling part of man, often as distinguished from the body. Will, consciousness, thought, regarded as separate from matter. Those are the first three definitions of spirit. Where was the supernatural? Spiritual definition of the spirit, or the soul as distinguished from the body or material matters. Of, from, or concerned with the intellect, intellectual. Of or consisting of spirit, not corporeal. Characterized by the ascendancy of the spirit, showing much refinement of thought and feeling. Whoa, intellectual, thought and feeling, spirit, interesting. Spirituality, spiritual character, quality or nature, as I have been accused of being sometimes. Second, the rights, jurisdiction, tithes, etc., belonging to the church. How interesting, spirit and spiritual and spirituality, with such an emphasis on human experience, human character. The first definitions in the series. As I said, I was really surprised when I read the dictionaries with those definitions. Note the naturalistic emphases, the thinking, motivating, feeling part of man. The thinking, feeling, motivating part of us. Showing much refinement of thought and feeling. Wow. Think of what Hamlet said to Horatio, who, as a student of mine once said, was the only together guy on the play. Hamlet says to Horatio, "Blessed are those whose blood and judgment are so well commedled, they are not a pipe for fortune's finger to sound what stop she please." When our blood and judgment, our passion, our emotions, our intellect, our reasoning are so well connected, integrated, we are free human beings, not fate's toys. So the question for me is, again, not is ethical culture spiritual, yes or no, but how do we conceive of the best of the human spirit? And does ethical culture touch the thinking, feeling, motivating part of us? Does ethical culture help us toward a refinement of thought and feeling? Call it spiritual if you like. Does it help us toward finer thoughts and feelings? I tend to think so. I better in my role. So when couples speak about their spiritual sense in planning a wedding, they sometimes feel and say there must be something greater than us that draws us toward it. Again, for the traditionally religious, it might be a deity. But I would respond as John Dewey does, of course there are things that are greater than we are and draw them toward us. They are our ideals. But our ideals are greater than we are, impel us toward them, but arise from our natural lived experiences in this world as we creatively and imaginatively and intelligently and feelingly reconstrue what is and imagine what might be better. What kind of meaning or purpose can a humanistic orientation like ethical culture offer? In responding to that couple about their wedding, I thought of a quotation from Ralph Waldo Emerson in the context of their spirituality observation. With them, I could only paraphrase it, but then I found it, and we used it in their ceremony. And it's often called, "What is Success?" And Emerson writes this: "To laugh often and love much, to win the respect of intelligent persons and the affection of children, to earn the approbation of honest critics, and to endure the betrayal of false friends, to appreciate beauty, to find the best in others, to give oneself, to live the world a bit better, whether by a healthy child, a garden patch, or a redeemed social condition, to have played and laughed with enthusiasm and sung with exultation, to know even one life has breathed easier because you have lived. This is to have succeeded." Emerson's words echo, I think, many of the sentiments and the comments of people I spoke of before. They help us shape our ideals. They help us feel a sense of interconnected human community. Can those experiences and ideals do something to us, for us, motivate us to greater refinement of thoughts and feeling, as the dictionary says, motivate us to act from a kind of base in those ideals, intellect and feeling, and leave the world, as Emerson says, a bit better? Can we become more aware, more appreciative of our place in the cosmic order of things, of time and space and evolution and nature and history? At one point, Adler says, spirituality is consciousness of infinite interrelatedness. And that's a naturalistic sense. Think of the astronomers who tell us we are all star stuff, right? The Big Bang happens, and a bunch of chemical reactions occur, and planets and stars are generated, and the sun throws off the Earth, and the Earth throws off the moon. And in that primordial soup, right? Remember the primordial soup? Chemicals get together, and life emerges, and we descend from them all. All of the biology, all of the chemistry, from the universe's beginning to you. We're all connected. It's all connected. How interesting. How wonderful. What a great story. At least as good as most religious myths. Can we think more clearly, honestly, discerningly about ourselves, our world, what is really important, what's really meaningful? Can we feel more related to and concerned about our fellow men, women, and children in this interrelated human family? Can we instill in ourselves and in others a bit more strength to deal with the pain, strife, struggle, hardship, suffering that most people will encounter at some time in their lives? Can we be compassionate companions with others in their troubles? And can we enhance the ability of others and ourselves to delight in the joyous and beautiful experiences of living? Can we acknowledge our finite yet significant capacity for reciprocal relationships of decency and respect, and find ways to add a bit of decency to the world we share? I think so, and I think our position as humanists in ethical culture helps us do it. Let me give a simple example, an example many of you have seen, I hope. The documentary, Won't You Be My Neighbor? About Fred Rogers, about Mr. Rogers. If you haven't seen it, go to your library and borrow it. Sitting next to me in the theater at Jacob Burns Theater in Pleasantville, of course, there was a couple, older couple, and we all sat while the credits rolled and it was still dark and nobody got up. And the man turned to me and said, "It's the second time I've seen this film, and I've cried both times." One of the scenes that will make you cry is a scene in which Fred Rogers is sitting in his backyard with his feet in a little child's wading pool full of cold water. And he says, "I'm cooling my feet because it's very hot today." The scene occurs at a time in American history when white people were trying to keep black children out of swimming pools. I can't remember the name of the officer, the police officer who stops by, a black man. And Fred Rogers says, "Hi, Officer Smith." And Officer Smith says, "Hi, Mr. Rogers, what are you doing?" And Fred Rogers says, "I'm cooling my feet in the pool here. Would you like to join me?" And the camera then focuses on two white feet and two black feet in a swimming pool together. Even I might be tempted to call that a spiritual moment. Can we lift up and uplift the human spirit, the spirits of our fellows and our own? Can we, heartened by our ideals, try to lift up spirits, our own and others, encouraging the best, offering companionship, fortitude, compassion, solace, consolation, care, love? Can we try to uplift spirits by acknowledging and articulating and embodying our interconnectedness with all things, especially our fellow human beings? Notice I keep saying we, because ethical culture is us. We don't transcend except horizontally. We don't transcend vertically beyond us. As Philip Appelman, the great humanist poet, says, we are all we've got. Ethical culture is us, not an abstract or mystical philosophy, not a codified set of rules, not a reliance on external supernatural forces, not on some acquiescence in a notion of fate. Ethical culture is rather the down-to-earth efforts we can make to elicit the best in others and ourselves. And by so doing, we can make more real that ideal of creating, as Adler said, the state of things where we will see life enhancing other life. Thank you all.
Our guest today is Dr. Robert Berson, who is the leader for the Ethical Society of Northern Westchester in Ossining, New York, as well as a clinical psychologist in private practice. Bob grew up in ethical culture, graduating from the Children's Sunday Assembly of the Riverdale Yonkers Society for Ethical Culture and from the Ethical Culture Fieldston School. Bob earned his bachelor's degree from Haverford College and earned graduate degrees from Harvard University, the Bank Street College of Education, Teachers College, and the City University of New York. Over the years, Bob taught at Fieldston and worked at several college counseling services.